people got onto the school board who ran the false platform of critical race theory, thinking that it's being taught in schools. And they went ahead and fired the superintendent without cause.
Wow.
And realizing, whoops, you can't do that. But again, these school board members had known nothing about the procedures, the laws, the protocols that are needed, and everything you need to do. And in an isolated meeting, they fired the superintendent because he was supporting mask mandates and he was supporting free speech and actual teaching of history.
There you go.
So vote.
So please vote. Yeah. What's that? I guess we can't go to Florida, right?
So
I can go to Florida.
Well, as it's written, we both can go to Florida,
Right.
but as it will be executed or facilitated,
I'll be
only you can go to. Yes.
My emotions will be protected because
Yes.
it's a safe space for white people now. Sorry for our sarcasm. We've been up for a little while, working a lot.
So I have a question. I've read like the critical mentoring book. I've been in a lot of these critical mentoring things, and also with CRT things. I just have a hard time, I guess, wrapping my brain around like just this where the steps to be taken, like where what the goal is with some of CRT and critical mentoring. I just personally I read it, I understand some of it, I kind of get it, but it's just not there.
Yeah. No, I think that's something I've heard before, Justin. And I think it goes back to how we switch our mindset. What Chris and I were talking about that, but it's really a switch in mindset more than anything else, which then impacts your behaviors and how you relate to others. Because critical mentoring is about relationships. That's the key element. And there's no way you can structure relationships unless you understand the what you're working with. Chris, you want to add to that?
I would say within that relationship, and I'm happy to delve into this as long as we need to. Because I think it's a really important point that's being brought up. And yes, at the core of all work with mentoring and of course education, it's about the relationship, but it's also understanding the experience of the individual that you're working with, understanding how that experience informs their perspective as well as your own. And at the core of it, I would say that critical race theory. So Justin was saying he's looked into it and wondering more about it. And so what my takeaway about critical race theory and considering like the critical analyses that I did in my graduate work experience and all that was basically looking at any perspective, like, so education, how is this impacting, is this being equity distributed? Is the experience equitable? Are all student experiences being represented within history? Are we making sure that, and it's not about making sure that, it's basically looking at the impact, essentially, right? You're analyzing the impact of education. Does it have an equitable impact on all communities? Does this law have an equitable impact on all communities? And the critical race component is just taking race within that critical analysis. You could say that it's feminist or critical feminist theory, critical, like every aspect of our society, we can apply that lens, and that is the critical analysis. That's all it is.
So it's just, you can do like critical poverty theory or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's just basically, if you're into statistics or analytical work, like, and you think of that function, the function is what you're applying to whatever that analysis is. So race, you put race in there, and that's the function. And oh, look at this data. Wow, we see disproportionate representation of X, Y, and Z. We need to fix that. That's all it is. But it got hyperbolic once Christopher Rufo got involved.
Yes.
And repackaged this whole conversation to a political gain of
Mhm.
where we are right now.
We don't mention Christopher Rufo in this presentation, on, well, I should say in the slides, but
Look
we
him up.
should talk about, yeah, we should definitely talk about what he's done to the conversation and how he and his followers have skewered what could be happening and redesigning our education after almost 2 years of a pandemic. But that's we'll talk about that. Thank you for that, Justin. That was great.
Yeah,
Question.
thank
Yeah.
you.
So I know that like you got like the parents, you guys were talking about this, who
Mhm.
get concerned, they don't, with CRT or critical theory, however you want to do it. I know there's like these like very small cases that get blown up where like there might be a book that like, or there might be something that's being taught that's like it's an individual teacher, or it's just like one thing in the curriculum that like might not be kosher, and that gets
Mhm.
blown up into this huge thing. So it's like I don't know, because I hopped on and uh full transparency, I I'm a Republican.
Mhm.
So I have full, so but I also just don't know.
Right.
Right.
I know that sometimes you have these like situations where you have like Trumpsonian people who are like hyperbolic about this,
Mhm.
Right.
um, instead of just like, because there's individual instances where stuff can be skewed way far left or way far right, you know, and
Yes.
something and they get blown up. Like there was this one book that I know got taught in one class, one specific like first or second grade class of like uh not AIDS or I, it was a different book, but it was just like a kid's book.
Mhm.
It's one instance and that got blown up, you know? So I just didn't, I hear all this stuff. I just don't know how to make odds and ends of it.
Yeah. I appreciate that, what you just stated.
Yeah.
Because this is something Chris and I talk about frequently. Like it's not anti-Republican or anti-white or anti-black or pro anything. It's really an examination of our lived experiences and not lived experiences, those that preceded us. And if you look at it, it's not Democratic leaning or Republican leaning. You're just like, oh, these things happen in the United States and across the world.
Mhm.
Let's pick it apart. In a very Sankofa. Let's look backwards to examine our present and paint our future. That's got nothing to do with the political divisions in society.
Right.
Yeah, I think
So,
I
yeah.
think that I think that there's a sense when there's a sense that like it's more divisive, at least on the right side. And I've heard arguments made like they just don't want, they think critical race theory is being taught, but they're okay with like with Black history being taught and stuff of that nature, but critical race theory, and it's like this weird like roundabout way of saying that we agree, but we don't like how you're phrasing it.
I again, like and again, Justin, I really appreciate you bringing this up, and I wish there were more conversations like this. And again, like I just can't stress enough that critical race theory is not being taught in any school. Like
No,
I don't know any school that's teaching it.
I don't
And
I don't think that is. I think that there's like with anything, there's teachers that might have like one or two things, or you might have like one or two things in the curriculum. Like like I grew up in a public school. My baby sister goes to Catholic school, and at her school they had like they had that video of like the race, right? And it had like all the different races that are racing around the track, and it shows like all the different like hurdles, and like that to me is just like, okay, yeah, that's just how it is. It's kind of like theatrical and a little bit like done up, but that's kind of what happened, you know?
Right.
Right.
Because of the political environment in which we're in and how hyperbolic everything is right now, coupled with the stress and anxiety of the pandemic and everything else.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I
But
just
this
think,
is
I just think it's hard to have open conversations because people are afraid of being ostracized and put into this
Absolutely.
bubble.
Yeah.
100%.
And again, I commend you.
Yeah.
I commend you, Justin, for this conversation.
yeah. And
All right.
you know, to your point, that's one of our objectives for this presentation is to elucidate the connection between critical mentoring, multicultural mentoring relationships, and define it, and then how to also use these discussions and conversations for different mentoring relationships and how to empower both the young person and the mentor.
Right.
So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a little icebreaker. We're going to set the stage, get into some best practices, and reflect about critical mentoring as a whole. Some ground rules we like to set up is that everyone participates, and participation can mean whatever. You know, when I was in the classroom, it was between level 1 and level 10. I just asked that you did it. And then respect. You know, how do we have respect for one another, both emotional, we don't have to worry about physical respect because we're online, but emotional and social respect, abundant grace for ourselves, for technology, for each other. We're not going to solve every issue today. Chris and I may want to, that may be our goal, but it's impossible. And then, you know, mic check. If our conversation is getting too crowded, just make sure who has the mic. An acronym I've heard and used is WAIT. Why am I talking? And I always like that one. Chris, you have anything to add to that?
That's it. It sounds good. And I really do appreciate, like, again, like this is intended to be an honest conversation. Yes. And so please, and again, I really appreciate Justin raising a relevant question at the very beginning here, which is a little hot topic, right? But let's respect each other. And again, let's not have a concern of what we're going to say, that we're going to get canceled because we say something. Let's have an honest conversation through this process and truly share what you're thinking in this moment. And what happens in the Zoom stays in the Zoom, just like Vegas. It stays here.
Yeah, exactly. And thanks, Laura, for being our administrator and tech guru. So here's who we are. That's me on the right. I'm Chris Daikos. Just kidding. James Miles. Executive Director of Mentor Washington, Richard Pryor of Pedagogy. And you can find me on social media as the Fresh Professor. And then my colleague, partner in crime, anti-social media person, advocate.
Social media person.
I was trying to say something really fluffy, but just my homie, Chris Daikos.
Hello, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Anti-social media. Hey, you know, we're rolling with it.
I'm on LinkedIn.
True. So before we jump into critical mentoring, let's first discuss what is a mentor. And I want to thank Laura for this graphic because I've never seen it until she sent it to me. So a mentor is all these things. A mentor is not all the other things. We're not an ATM machine.
Right.
I think that goes without saying. Which is always, you know, I gotta be pedantic about ATM machine, an automatic teller machine. Anyway. So we're gonna do a quick check-in, quick icebreaker with Meg Thee Stallion and Ariana Grande. Everyone should be able to have access to emojis on your device. On an Apple computer, I use Control, Command, Spacebar. Chris or Laura, do you know what you use on a PC?
No.
No?
I haven't had a PC.
Right click, I'm guessing. There's also something called the meme or emojikeyboard.net. You can find your emojis there. So we're going to do this quickly. Who is your mentor? Pick an emoji that represents your mentor. Favorite teacher, least favorite teacher. Who are you were in the crisis? What is your least favorite characteristic of a mentor? And what is your favorite characteristic of a mentor? And we could just throw that into the chat. So I will start and try to find a mentor that represents my mentor. That's my mother. Always like she was really good at supporting me, but also like, you doofus. I love this. You have the cross. Mariah's got a cowboy or a cow yellow person, cow emoji. I love the masks. Yes.
For a Windows 10 computer,
Yes.
press the Windows key and period at the same time, and you should get emojis pop up.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I see characteristics in ear, books, ear, reading, brain, talking. Yeah. And if you want to also share why you chose these different emojis, feel free to do that too. You could put that in the chat. You could open up your mic. Laura likes to party. Is that your least favorite or your favorite characteristic of a mentor?
It's my favorite, and it's that they celebrate with us.
Got it. Thank you. Susanna, looks like you're through a computer on fire. That's also awesome. A hamburger,
I think
Mariah.
it's a teacher.
Oh, it's a teacher.
Not a computer.
It's yeah, it's a teacher, and he was fire. That's what I was trying to say.
Got it. I appreciate that. Well, my bad vision is not helping. Excellent. Well, we could keep moving on. I appreciate everyone participating. Quickly fill in the chat. Was it easy to remember your favorite characteristic of a mentor, least favorite? And how was your personality as a youth compatible or incompatible with your mentor? As my mentor was my mother, it was easy to remember that because she was great. She guided me through a lot. And I would say when I was a middle school student, 12, 13, we were very incompatible, but now we are very compatible. I check with my mom every day. Chris, how about you?
My mentor, I could have had what I appreciate about all the mentor work that you and I have been doing, the research you've been doing on it, is that I really didn't have a very good mentor and did not have a consistent mentor. Wish I did. And considering like life choices and experiences, probably would have been a lot easier.
Yeah.
So my mentor, I was looking for the emoji of like just googly eye, like eyes everywhere, because my mentor, brilliant guy.
Right.
Learned a lot from him. And actually he was younger than me.
Yeah.
But he was my doctoral advisor, learned a lot from him, but again, he was inconsistent.
Yeah.
And then bailed
on. Yes, I know this person, and from what I've gathered, I can see that.
Yeah. Brilliant, great guy,
yeah.
Good friend. Not the best mentor.
And Mariah also had an inconsistent mentor.
Yeah.
Which studies show is actually more damaging than having no mentor at all. And you didn't have one until you entered the workforce. Thank you, Laura, for sharing that. A lot of secrets. Oh, yeah. Well, that's a great opening up of that heart capacity, Terry. Thank you for sharing that. Cool. Let's keep it moving. So for those that don't know, here's Mentor Washington. We work with over 140 nonprofits, like many on this call, across Washington State, in all 39 counties and 29 tribes, fostering positive youth development around mentoring. We do training, capacity building, funding, quality assurance, and policy and advocacy. And we also support mentor recruitment with our Mentor Connector. And then, of course, tracking and evaluation as the state umbrella for mentoring with our public-private partnership. Whoops. So we're going to set the stage of mentoring. Chris, you want to bounce back and forth with this one?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I took on this job, I was already mentoring other young educators and young professionals, but never really dug deep into the history of mentoring, and to Justin's earlier question, really examining, right, our history, our shared history. And if you look at the origins of mentor, it's actually the goddess Athena dressing up or pretending to be a mentor, using the name mentor,
Right.
to mentor Telemachus, Odysseus' son, as Odysseus goes on his trek to fight back for his wife Penelope.
Yeah, mentor was a friend of Odysseus, and then Athena, mystically or whatever, was able to embody him, go into his body and use him as a vehicle to help guide Telemachus and help him make decisions, right? Like it was a
Right.
decision-making process. He was a good advisor, and based off, the goddess's insight, and I'm assuming maybe a mentor's life experience informed all those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Homer thought this all the way through.
Yeah, but the outcome is that Athena's really encouraging Telemachus to do stuff that may be against what he wants to do, right? Or maybe just what she imagines a young man should be doing,
Right?
Especially a young man of a soldier, a renowned soldier.
Mhm.
So oftentimes we see that same thing happening, where the adult seeks to impart their ideas, their
Mhm.
insight for a young person without taking into any consideration that young person's experiences, right?
Right.
When we meet a young person as a mentor, they are not empty vessels. They're filled with a plethora of experiences that are just as valid as and important as ours.
Right.
And oftentimes we see mentees, especially those of color, subjugated and relegated to trying to fit in, so to speak.
And that's a critical perspective, right?
Critical perspective. Yes.
You're looking to seek to understand the behaviors in that youth's experience, so that it informs how you are that invisible hand guiding that kiddo along.
Mm-hmm. And always feel free to throw in a question, comment into the chat, mute yourself. We really want to have open conversations.
Yeah.
And keep the ideas flowing. So there's a framework, right? Mentoring may be able to lessen the negative effects of racial discrimination. How about just getting rid of racial discrimination? Let's think about that. How do we send a message of solidarity that acknowledges they're experiencing, and more importantly, offers context, provide the process the difficult times we're living through?
And in that process, of course, you may not necessarily have the same experience as that individual. You may not have that same experience as what the youth is experiencing, but you can still try to empathize as much as possible, hear them. And just by listening is showing that empathetic response in your leadership experience right there, right? They're seeing that you are someone that you will be advocating for them, but also someone who is willing to listen without judgment.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. Let's talk about continua.
Oh, okay. All right. We're a team of educational leaders, psychologists. We help support many districts throughout the state and nation. We use what's known as a trauma-informed multi-tiered systems of support, which is just a fancy way of saying we use the public health model, the 3-tiered system, to help promote evidence-based practice. And in that process, trauma-informed means basically that the individual that we are serving, be it a student, be it a mentee, be it a patient, that individual is at the center of our thoughts when we are thinking about the practice that we are engaging in. And again, we serve districts across the nation, but in Snohomish County, we've been in there for 5 years promoting trauma-informed practices throughout schools, throughout the entire county. And James works with us often.
Indeed.
And so when we talk about trauma-informed MTSS, again, that fancy word, the 3-tiered system, right? Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, that's the public health model. It shouldn't be a surprise or shocking or new to anybody. And when I say the public health model, if you want an example of that, an effective intervention was smoking, right? An effective intervention. So a Tier 1 intervention would have been a billboard saying don't smoke, or a TV advertisement saying don't smoke and explaining what it is. A Tier 2 intervention, if that didn't work for you and you're still smoking, you would probably maybe go to the drugstore and get Nicorette or the patch. Use that because it's a ready-made off-the-shelf intervention. In a Tier 3 intervention, if that didn't work, would be meeting your doctor, getting like maybe Chantix prescribed to you because it works for you physiologically. It's not going to impact your health in a negative way. Or the most effective is hypnosis. So counseling with hypnosis to understand why and practicing actually results in the most significant reduction of smoking. An example where it didn't really work well would be, say, our nation's COVID response. There was miscommunication on a Tier 1 level. We heard conflicting information all the time about it. The Tier 2 level about what we should be doing, again, conflicting information. Maybe at the Tier 3 level was most effective because that's when you're actually seeing a doctor and you're in there getting treatment. But Tier 1 and 2, so our model would be way bigger probably at Tier 3 than it should be because we're not meeting all the needs at Tier 1. The reason why we're bringing this up is because we've also viewed this as an approach of thinking about mentoring, because as a mentor, you are not just stuck with the individual kiddo, you are thinking about the systems of which that kiddo is working in and experiencing throughout their day. And so at the Tier 1 level, there are ways that you can be supported as well, because you want to know that universal language being used at the school, being used at the after-school program, whatever else that kid is experiencing. And again, at the Tier 2 level, what is an intervention that the kiddo may be involved in at school or maybe in the after-school program, and how can you support that? Tier 3, is that kiddo receiving counseling? Is there something involved that where you're experiencing that and you can make sure that you are incorporating a language that's being used so that there's consistent language across the board for this kiddo and it's not confusing as they move throughout the day? We're all on the same page to support that kid, and a mentor could be that glue across the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 levels.
That's exactly it. Thanks, Chris, for elucidating that for us.
Sorry.
No, it was great. I mean, Laura and I talk about this frequently, how, to put it in the context of urban vernacular, we're the plug as mentors, right? We're able to connect young people to those Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 supports. Perfect.
All right. So I'm sorry, I was looking to make sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. So I kind of mentioned there, like, again, the core components at MTSS, like we know that it results in team-driven leadership, and there is no reason that a mentor can't be viewed as a member of that team. Again, I would ideally, through an agency in which you're practicing, they agree with this and they are help advocate that you are involved in some of these conversations. What is the data being collected? Like, where is the data informed process of your mentoring practice? What are the results of the kids' academic progress? What's the data on the kiddos' behavioral progress? Is there family, school, and community partnering? And if there is, why is the mentor involved? Just because it's there's an after school program or something like that, it doesn't mean that we can't have a mentoring program involved. And we all know that layered continuum supports through evidence-based practice is the best way to actually see behavioral changes and positive life outcomes for many of the kiddos that we serve. And that evidence-based practice is something that ideally you're trained in as well. So if there's a behavioral intervention that a kiddo is involved in and the school's using it and the after school program's using it, why isn't the mentor involved in that conversation and making sure that they're actually practicing potentially interventional fidelity? And when I'm describing interventions, it's not like a complex process. Most effective interventions are what we call low cost, high yield. Low cost means it's simple. It may be just reframing a phrase or a way of thinking for that kiddo, and you're helping them through that process. It may be a CBT practice, cognitive behavioral therapeutic, that is very simple to implement. We can later talk about that at a different professional development, but ideally you're involved in that conversation.
Chris, do you have an example of something that's low cost, high yield?
So self-monitoring. So
Yeah.
James and I just did a presentation talking about basically CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But one of the simplest things that is used as a CBT type intervention is self-monitoring, where you're thinking about the behavior you're engaging in, right? You stop for a moment. Why did I just do that? I just yelled at that person. Let me think about why. What was the setting event? What was the experience I was having prior to that? What was the potential trigger that resulted in my stress response in that moment? And ideally, James, my mentor, is helping me think about the replacement behavior from yelling to maybe, hey, Chris, next time you do that and you get upset, maybe take a pause or maybe restructure, or what is this intervention that we're thinking of a replacement behavior instead of yelling at somebody, or be it running out of the classroom. Younger kiddos I often worked with often had what we called chronic eloping. They're always running out of the classroom. So what we did is thinking about that kiddo, one, being able to predict that I know when this lesson is happening, I'm going to employ a self-soothing strategy where I'm calming myself down, bringing my stress level down so that I can access the learning and ideally persevere through that.
So like social emotional learning.
It's a component of it.
Yeah.
Like social emotional learning, there's so much more. And thank you for bringing that up, because there's no reason why you all can't be using the same language of whatever curriculum they're using. And social emotional learning should not be viewed as something that's kind of like, I'm a vet, I'm my background, I'm a ranger, I was a hockey player. So like the machismo boxes are all checked off here, right? Social emotional learning, for many people, they often think about like, this is just, whiny, touchy-feely, victim perspective. No, it's actually pushes resilience. So that skill I just talked about, where kids often run out of the class, we're trying to teach that kid how to be resilient through that social emotional learning curricula, or that behavioral intervention that we're trying to help this kid persevere.
So I know my mom's a teacher. She deals with behavioral kids, right? They want her to be doing the social emotional learning, and I'll talk about it with her a lot, and she says for a portion of the kids that might work, but for those kids that are a lot of the kids that she deals with, it's always like a one-on-one basis on how you deal with them. Some kids in their response, you need to respond a little bit more gently, and other kids it's like, okay, well, it's cold outside, I told you to put your jacket on and you're just being defiant, so we're going to go outside without your jacket, and you can't come back inside because I have to take the whole class back in. And then next time they're going to wear their jacket.
So I hear exactly what you're saying, and I think I do. Like, it's what I'm suggesting is that so your mom is working in special ed.
Yeah, she deals with behavioral kids and kids that are lower on the developmental scale.
That's my background. When I first started teaching, is I was doing a job where I was teaching the students with emotional behavior disorders. And so looking at our tier chart here, right? The tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, the kiddo that your mom's working with shouldn't just be getting SEL curriculum, right? It shouldn't just be social emotional learning curriculum. There should be social emotion curriculum for everybody in the entire school. And so of course that kid should get that curriculum because everybody in the school is getting it. That shouldn't be the only intervention for that kid. There should have been a tier 2 intervention for that kiddo. And it sounds like that kiddo is in a special ed class. So that is actually beyond tier 3 even. Tier 3 is individualized. All kids in special ed have an individualized education plan. They all get that. But the additional intervention for that kiddo could arguably be even a tier 4. And it needs to be an individualized intervention for that kid. So ideally that kid's getting counseling. Ideally that kid is getting specialized instruction around their emotional responses versus just a curriculum that everybody in the entire school gets on a tier 1 level. Does that make sense? Okay.
No, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little,
Mhm.
and yeah, individual. Yeah, there's Renee just put that into the chat.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of the kids that she deals with are like from lower economic backgrounds. So accessing some stuff, it's like all through the school.
Right.
So like how
Right.
can like mentoring programs not replace but supplement what the schools are doing with that?
That would be amazing that schools actually engage in making sure that if there is a off-the-shelf intervention, a tier 2 intervention, that you, Justin, are completely familiar with it. And when you're working with your kiddo as a mentor, you're aware of how that kid should be accessing that intervention. Ideally, the school is open to that access, or if not, the organization which you're working with is advocating for mentors to actually be able to get in there. So it would be amazing, like with your mother, one of her students, that you are involved as well as a mentor, and you're very familiar with what those interventions need to be to support what was going on throughout the school day and potentially in the after school program.
So what I'm hearing, Chris, is the need for CBOs and schools to actually speak to one another, share common language. I mean, this tier 1, share common language.
Common
But
language.
oftentimes, that doesn't happen.
Right. And just think about that with common language. The idea,
Right.
This is why we advocate for common language. Where do you want your kiddo's cognitive load to be? Do you want that kiddo to have to start to understand, like, what did you mean by X, Y, and Z? Because we mean something else by that, right? So let's all have common language on that, on what this intervention is, and the practice and fidelity of evidence-based practice. Fidelity is not just for marriage. It needs to be also for interventions.
Well stated. I see what Terry put into the chat, that after 10 years, you're just now getting access to the DBT curriculum in the
DBT
juvenile
is good.
system.
Good
Yeah.
stuff. James Mazza wrote a really good book on that.
Yeah.
From UW. And that's dialectical behavioral therapy, which is part of kind of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So evidence-based practice, what do we mean by that? Evidence-based practice means that it has been peer reviewed. It has been replicated more than once. James and I can go do a study, right? And we get one result. Well, just because James and I did a survey of 100 people and they said X, that doesn't mean that's evidence, right? It's one data point. That doesn't mean that that research is sound and it means the same thing for everybody. That's just one data point. And so evidence-based practice means that it has been replicated more than once, and that the findings are continue to be supported over and over and over again. One study that has been replicated several times is the adverse childhood experience study. And if you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend to start delving into that. And I believe we talk about that a bit here too.
We do, yeah. So critical mentoring, as defined by Dr. Tori Weiston Serdan, seeks to move mentoring research and practice to what we were talking about at the top of this call: critical examination of race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, as it pertains to mentoring. So examination, if we look at the evidence-based practices that Chris and I just talked about, right? We interviewed 100 people. That's not evidence, right? You've interviewed 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people, all of the young people in the United States of America. You get some evidence behind that. Critical mentoring would then look at that evidence as it relates to the intersectionality of race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, to understand better the practice of mentoring and how to better support young people. So it's evidence taken into context.
Meeting the kiddo.
Challenging deficit-based notions, right? Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just saying, meeting the kiddo where they are.
Meeting the kiddo where they are, right?
So
Yeah.
So I've kind of looked at like just treating them as individuals. That's kind of how I looked at it, like with this whole intersectionality, race, ethnicity, class, gender, all that stuff, like just meeting them where they are and understanding them on a more personal level. That's how I've understood it.
Mhm.
Am I crossing wires or something?
No, you're sounds like you're kind of on point.
Yeah. Yeah, and you that's it. And Tom, thanks for sharing the WISP data.
Yeah.
Because that's a great thing to talk about. Critical examination, where that data comes from is not all of the evidence, right? It's basically just one large organization. It's where we get all the evidence from in the WISP data, but that does not involve all the mentoring organizations happening around in Washington State. So here's some of the practices that define critical mentoring: fully considering race, ethnicity, gender, class, and sexuality when building infrastructure. Focusing on critical consciousness and transformation rather than assimilation and adaptation, right? So rather than say like, well, here's how you deal with the racism, it's like racism is here, or sexism is here. What ways can we navigate that to create a better society for all of us? And how do we do this together, right?
Right.
Emphasis on the whole community, not just the individual, which could be contrarian to many, pull yourself up by your bootstraps theories. But it's very community-based, very community involved. From the very inception, the needs of the community have to be central. That old "not about us, without us" has to be part of it. And then promoting that and supporting that mentor protege partnerships for community transformation, right? We all individuals, but individuals are part of the community. The only way to change a community or transform a community is to change the individuals within it.
And so we wanted to also get into how, if we go to the next slide, when we're thinking about critical mentoring and we're thinking about the student experience, we also need to understand that some of the behaviors that our students are engaging in, and when I say behavior doesn't have to be like lashing out or acting inappropriately in the class. It can also be a depressive state or an anxiety state that one has a disposition towards based off their experiences. And so what we're looking at, like, I'm sure you're wondering what the heck am I looking at right now? And so it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I get it.
James gets this. We'll just leave this here and you interpret. So what we're looking at on the right side, that's not a Jackson Pollock painting. That is looking at a nucleus and the dendrites and pulling off it. And we're looking at the bright things there. Those are synapses where dendrites are coming together. And you're literally this blew my mind when I started, like years ago, started studying psychology and behavior. And the idea that there's actual physiology to our thoughts, there's physiology to our like neurologically, there's physiology inside of us to our behaviors. There are actual pathways based off like just my movement of the arm here. There are neural pathways on that movement. That has blown, like when I first learned about that, I was like, wow, that's fascinating that this is not a metaphysical box, right? Like ideas don't just seep in. They are structured within us. And so our behaviors can be changed. Our thought processes can change. But We also need to understand the environmental impact that resulted in certain pathways that are already developed. So why a kid may have a really bad stress response. When I say stress response, like someone said something, looked at them sideways, or they thought they were given a task that they thought they couldn't achieve. And then all of a sudden there is this emotional outburst. This is exactly, Justin, the neurophysiology of our behaviors. So the example on the left here of that car, the road there, I often talk about these neural pathways. And when we look at the thicker ones, that's called myelination. So the myelination, the road there represents myelination. And myelination are behaviors that you engage in that you don't even think about. So the example I often give, here's a complex behavior that many of you have probably engaged in that are well myelinated and you probably didn't even think about doing it, but you did it. You're at work, stressful day at work, a lot of concerns about the people you're working with, or a mentee that you are really concerned about, and you're driving home and you're just lost in thought. And you're not thinking about, oh, a stop sign's about to come up, or this red light, or I need to make a left at this store, or whatever. I know there's a speed trap over here, right? You know, like you're thinking about all these things and you managed it and you got home, but you have no memory of driving home. And you're thinking about like, oh my God, I didn't run anybody over. I don't have police cars chasing me. My car, there's no bumps, you know, there's no bumps in the bumper or anything like that, no dents in the bumper, and I'm good. That is a myelinated behavior because you've done it over and over and over again, and it's been effective. It's been reinforced because it's effective. Also, the path, the woods, when you go hiking. So when you go hiking, do you look for the trail or do you bust out a machete and start creating your own pathway? And so the trail here is basically kind of like these thinner pathways, right? It's not as well developed as a road. And the woods basically are these dendrites that aren't even connected yet. They have not connected. There isn't a trail that meets up. And so the good news is, if we can go to the next slide, thinking about the environment in which we are in and thinking about these neural pathways. And again, like these tree limbs, I like to think about basically as these dendrites. The good news is, even though it's been reinforced by the environment, we can actually shift that reinforcement process as mentors, motivate them to do something else, show the effectiveness of how that behavior can lead towards more success without as much adversity, probably. And you can start pruning away at the old behaviors. We can actually prune neural pathways and develop new ones, and mentors can be the advocate in the support process in that beyond the school environment.
Yeah. One example I have from when I was teaching elementary school, and I was a guest artist bouncing around the different schools around the city. And, you know, I'd go to this one school and this one young person would always act out. Every time I said, all right, let's get in a circle, we're going to talk about X, Y, Z. He would always, oh man, this is great, and get into talk to his friends. So I'd go over, stand next to him and just look him in the eye and say, hey, I see you. If you ever want my attention, just let me know. And then, you know, come back to class and he'd do the same thing. After a while, all right, let's get into a circle. Mr. Miles, can I say something? Of course. His behavior changed, right? His pathways were well developed. Previously, to get attention, he'd cause a ruckus, and you know, sometimes that attention would get him kicked out of class or get him put into a corner. But if you can prune those neural pathways, like if you want to get attention, all I have to do is just let me know and I'm there.
Right.
Obviously, this kid was ostracized from other teachers. He's like, oh, okay, I've figured out a new way to gain or avoid that's the what behavior, functional behavior, to gain or avoid.
Yeah, James has hit a key point there. And I geek out on this. Like I'll be stuck in traffic and I'll start thinking about gain or avoid and try to think of a behavior that does not seek to gain or avoid. And arguably all behaviors are at the core. The basic function is gain or avoid. We can prune the onion layer back on that behavior and it will come down to a gain or avoid. One thing I didn't state in here also is that the point of these the photos of all these trees is that we adapt to our environment, right? We adapt to our environment. We need to survive, and we're gonna get what we need one way or the other. We're gonna gain what we need to survive one way or the other. And if we're in a toxic environment, if we're in an environment that doesn't have all of our basic Maslow needs being met, we're going to establish a behavior to gain that need. That behavior may serve a function in that environment, but also it may not translate well in a school environment or a work environment. And so the goal being is that we want to have behaviors that our kiddos can engage in that function across all environments. And so we want that generalization behavior versus the maladaptive behavior. Maladaptive being bad, adaptation, doesn't adapt well in all environments, can potentially be imposing, but it serves a function.
May I share an example really
Absolutely.
fast?
Yes.
A young lady that I was working with, she was 17 in high school, and she had just moved to a different state from her family. She was living with an aunt. She was going to school, and had left like everybody she had known. And her attendance dropped off drastically, and come to find out, she would be skipping school to go to the skate park with some friends. And through like conversation with her, we recognized that her skipping school to go to the skate park was her way of developing relationships and connections with people her own age, and like fulfilling that need of being around people that care about her and that she cares about. And so like when we were thinking about her attendance and having conversations about her attendance, that was the thing that we needed to kind of find a solution for, was how are you getting these relationships and how are you connecting with people in a school setting and outside of school setting. And that it was really difficult, but that was the underlying need that she was trying to meet. And it just like wasn't helping her graduate high school, which was also a need for her. So how did those two things balance? And a mentor was really helpful in figuring out some of those other opportunities for her to develop these relationships.
Thank you. That's a great example. And I just want to also emphasize that we can't look at the behavior in isolation and just think about what the gain or void is, right? It has to be through the students. So the example just given, like Laura was pointing out, that she had to understand that student and engage that student to understand what is the function of this behavior. And behavior can have more than one function as well, right? But for the purpose of that conversation, well, where is the impediment as well here, right? Because you're missing all this instruction. So how can we figure out how to meet that need, the function of the behavior, as well as the intervention being keeping you in school at the same time? We don't want to deny that need.
Yeah. So now's the time for us to do some breakouts. Let's take 60 seconds to just privately reflect. What have you learned about how environment relates to critical mentoring? How can this inform your own mentoring practices, or for the practices of the mentors that you work with? And then what questions still remain? We are running short on time, and I think that's okay. I'd rather have a great...
I've been involved in that are mentor-based have all been student-driven. All interventions that I've been involved in that have been successful in school settings have been student-driven, because they identify the intervention, they agree with the intervention. When I say identify, you're presenting a few ideas to them, but you know what direction they're going.
Right.
You're guiding that process.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Guiding that, I mean, that's part of the match support that is in our elements of effective practice. Understanding how a young person matches with their mentor.
Yeah.
But this is elevating it. Thanks, Chris.
We said the same thing in our group, James. You know, we started off with youth initiated mentoring. There is stuff coming up, you know, Dr. Gene Roach is where they do select your mentor, and then we train the mentors. And so that was part of it, but it is co-designed. Someone in our group, Justin, talked about the co-designed, which is kind of a shared responsibility. And then we talked about trauma, that, you know, we did a report, Mentor Washington 4 or 5 years ago, Role of Risk, and 70% of young folks that were going to mentoring programs had touched social services, 70%. So meaning that,
Mhm.
there is trauma and they're coming through the front doors. So it's more than just going off and just hanging out. It's
Right.
really, what are you working intentionally? You working on projects, you working on activity. Doesn't mean you're a caseworker or a social worker, but it's just knowing that there is going to be trauma so you don't re-traumatize. And then we had Terry, who works in the juvenile justice settings, talked about that in itself. The environment can be toxic. So how do you do the mentoring inside a juvenile justice setting that, although you're behind bars, you might be in a jumpsuit, it's a different environment than that. So that even had some thought in how that works in the juvenile justice system.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, how the environment has that much of a greater impact when
Right.
your environment is so literally restrictive.
Right.
Right.
Right. Ideally, yeah. I mean, I can go further in that conversation.
Yeah, we go on and on about this.
You're like, oh, you want to talk about that?
Right.
Ah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as special educators, that term least restrictive environment is something that's thrust upon us all the
Mhm.
time. Right.
I'm just immediately thinking of skills for that kiddo to develop to deal with that toxic environment in which they're in.
Yes. Right.
Right? Like
Right.
we want some coping skills so that kiddo can access the mentoring and richness.
Yeah.
All right.
So now we're talking about putting ideas to action. We'll move swiftly through this. This is the common language that we talked about earlier, and that young people have a shared understanding, right? That's called that do it for the culture. Chris and I had this conversation yesterday about doing it for the community and how there's a different play on that. So Urban Dictionary defines do as the culture is requesting something carried out for a specific action for the benefit of a shared culture, particularly the communities of color. That's strong because we're not all monoliths, but there is some common language, cultural, that all of us, especially those that live on the United States, share, regardless of gender or sexuality or race.
Mhm.
For youth of culture or young people of color, their home culture and the youth culture, there may be some crossover, and this is for all students, but sometimes it's not. And that comes down to the language, the values, beliefs, traditions, social norms, history, art, literature, and then the colloquialisms, the slang. I mentioned earlier about being the plug. That's something from the youth culture that I've taken into my home culture, right? Music, the television, the technology, fashion, the social dances, right? Humor and social media. This is Dr. Geneva Gay out of UW. CRP is defined as using the knowledge, prior experiences, terms of reference, and performance styles of diverse students to make curricula more relevant. I've said this before, but oftentimes when you look up the word mentor in other languages, it comes out to be educator. So there's a crossover, which is why I often talk about pedagogy and mentoring, and I do the overlap because the ethos is shared. Here's some great examples of how you can apply CRP, understanding the youth, right? Chris was just talking about this.
Right.
How do we understand our young people? What languages do they speak? What experiences do they have? How do they see the world? Where do they fit in on the social pyramid? And how do the youth demonstrate their understanding? Tom and I have talked about like project-based learning, right? How do you understand, if you're in a mentoring relationship, it's great to have just a person to chat with. But as you also said, we're not case managers, right? We're not psychiatrists. However, we can help you understand something. That could be academic, that could be social, that could be emotional.
Right.
But how do you demonstrate that understanding? And then, of course, youth are digital natives. It's interesting. I noticed there's something happened recently where my young children became more adept at technology than I did. And I was like, when did this switch happen? Right? Because I used to have to set up their computers, used to have to do all their phone stuff. And I was just like, hey, Dad, let me do this for you. And I'm like, when did this happen? Yeah. And of course, where do you find youth culture? These are memes. We all seen, the Bernie Sanders memes and LeBron and hip hop cupcakes. And then these other ones, if my screen would load, with Conor McGregor Cardi B. I mean, youth culture is so pervasive. You now see it even in the president of the United States. We'll keep going here. And whoops, back up real quick. Where do you find youth culture? This list is long. Many people on this call have seen this list before. So I'm actually going to skip our second breakout, talk
Okay.
about youth culture, and jump right into Brofenbrenner.
Oh boy. Okay.
So Chris, you have about
For sake
15
of time,
minutes.
got it. So Brofenbrenner's ecological theory is just kind of a lot of what we've just been talking about is that the individual, and again, like thinking earlier, I'm trying to like couch this in our conversation today instead of going through my typical, spiel on this. And so at the very beginning, we were talking about critical race theory and the debate right now within schools and its impact in school board decision making and everything right now across our nation. And our youth are experiencing that. And so again, understanding that the individual at the middle here, that red dot in the middle, a big circle there, that individual from birth on is being influenced, even arguably in utero, right? Like it's being influenced by the micro system around them, right? The family, the health services, their neighborhood, the sounds and experiences all around them, the language being used around them, the perspectives that the individuals have around them, because it's creating that mental model, right? So again, that mental model, think about all those neural pathways and those dendrites and everything going off. That is the mental model. That is the structure of it in the thinking. And so the microsystem, of course, is also being influenced by the exosystem, which is your family, like you yourself are being also influenced by mass media, by social services, by laws, by your neighbors, by your families and friends. The macro system is the attitude and ideologies of the culture in which you are experiencing. And so that is influencing the exosystem as well. That all, even though it's often the microsystem, eventually percolates down to the individual and influencing the mental model and structure and experience. The other thing that we need to think about, especially as adults, and thank you, James, for emphasizing youth culture, because we need to understand the chronos system, which is our own experiences aren't necessarily the same as youth experience now. So when we have mass media on this little model here, I would actually move that from the exosystem and drop it right on the individual. Why? Because we all have these handheld computers, right? We all have these cell phones buzzing, dinging, flashing lights at us and drawing our attention so that it is right on the individual. So sometimes it can actually skip over that microsystem and go straight to the individual. Again, when we think about the chronos system, we need to think about our experience and what that was. Right now, if we could go to the next slide, please. Just a little side note here. We've often heard older people saying kids today are different, right? We heard that when we were kids, right? I'm sure our parents heard that when they were kids.
Mm-hmm.
Today, there's data. Kids' development is very different than our experience because, again, think about the digital technology that immediately impacts their day-to-day experience. We did not have that. We know that kids are experiencing more anxiety, stress. They were experiencing more anxiety and stress prior to the pandemic because of this digital platform that has resulted in hyperbolic behavior. Like it's just coming at them all the time. Everybody's screaming at them. And then of course they're having some stress responses. And when I'm joking about the screaming, I'm talking about the amount of information that is just being piled onto them about X, Y, or Z.
Mm-hmm.
So the good news, again, I talked about it earlier. The good news is that we can actually, if you go to the next slide, we can prune these behaviors. We can prune these thoughts. We can actually help our kiddos in being that stable adult, that consistent, stable adult that is of a sound voice, right? We are the anchor in this chaotic storm that our kiddos are experiencing. And so again, if we understand the evidence-based interventions that are being employed in schools, if we understand the evidence-based interventions that would be best serve our kiddo, and by knowing our kiddo, by listening to them and understanding what will be effective, we can be really good at helping them prune maladaptive behaviors and emphasize and make that myelination of those healthy interactions and behaviors that we hope they engage in. Go to the next slide. And so when I was talking about the microsystem, but Brofenberg's ecological theory, one thing to think about is adverse childhood experiences that may be within that microsystem or macro system or exosystem even, right? And so understanding that the adverse childhood experience study, which has been replicated multiple times since basically the mid 90s, it's been replicated several times. And what they've found is that youth and individuals, not just youth, individuals who experience these stressors as such as like physical abuse, emotional, sexual, physical neglect, emotional neglect, household dysfunction results in the likelihood of developing, again, what we refer to as maladaptive behaviors that result in negative life outcomes. You can have a maladaptive behavior, it serves a function environment, and then maybe you adjust it and fix it and it served a purpose and you learn to be healthier way of getting what you need, that gain or void. But what they have found out is that many who experience all these life stresses prior are engaging in these maladaptive behaviors that actually result in shortened life outcomes.
That's deep. Yeah.
And so again, like I can't stress enough, it's been replicated several times. Look at, it's been replicated in multiple environments, and we're talking well over we're talking millions of participants now within these studies. And the study's findings are the same over and over and over again. So what do we mean by trauma informed? Because if we're talking about experiences of trauma, and again, I can't stand the phrase trauma informed, to be honest. Like I wish this was like, and that's what the field calls it. That's what the research names it. If I had my way, I would change it to like, resilience informed, or how to like basically have a positive perspective. When they say trauma informed, what they're trying to say is, look, understand the experience of the kiddo and it is informing what you're doing, or your patient or your client. You're listening to their experience, and based on that experience, you're creating that framework to understand and recognize how to respond to that individual's experience. You want to emphasize the physical and psychological safety factors, right? So what safety is involved, and making sure that they know that this is fine, this is safe, and we're going to be working towards, we're not judging you based off your experience. Many of us who've been abused, we may feel bad about that experience and must be something wrong with us is why we had that experience, but understanding that I'm not judging you based off that experience. I'm here for you now. So you're switching from what is wrong with you, or to tell me about your experience. We don't want to blame the individual. Like, what's wrong with you? What happened to you?
Yeah. And I would say we started talking about critical mentoring, but it has to be informed by, no pun intended, trauma informed, ACEs, environmental, understanding Brofenbrenner factors, the cultures of young people you're working with. Because basically critical mentoring is really just good mentoring. Just like critical teaching is just good teaching. You're really understanding the population you're working with. You're not making judgments. You're asking more questions, very Socratic, very, centered on either the patient, the young person, the individual you're working with. Just want to highlight that because it's bringing it all together. It is the hard part.
Right.
Learn about the experience, believing them. Yep. Thank you, Laura.
I would say this is the critical, right? This is the critical component. We're analyzing, we are understanding the individual. And again, it is not meant to be a victim admiration.
No.
I can't stress that enough. We are not advocating victim admiration. And again, can't stand the language because some people misinterpret it that way. But again, this is about building that, getting that grit, right? Like getting that kid to be resilient, getting that kid to be able to identify like, you know what, that was messed up and I got a skewed perspective because I was messed up, but I'm okay. And I can move beyond that because I have these skills now to move beyond that. Thank you, mentor, for helping me foster those skills.
Exactly. Yes, Laura.
Well, next slide, I think.
Next slide. Yeah.
So trauma-informed organizations, they realize that, again, they're most likely aware of the ACE study, right? They're aware that adverse experiences, and again, it's not a victimization perspective, but the adverse experience one may have in youth may actually result in some myelinated neural pathways that are resulting in maladaptive behaviors. And so a trauma-informed organization recognizes the signs and symptoms of those behaviors and seeks to help the client and family, staff, and potentially even mentors to help that individual get past that maladaptive behavior or that experience or that trauma that they experienced. And integrate that knowledge to inform the policies and procedures that you are employing as an organization. And of course, you don't want to have that person relive that experience over and over again.
Right. And this is from the Search Institute's developmental framework. What young people need is, and relationships look like, express care. Show me that I matter to you, right? Be present for them. Providing support, help complete tasks and achieve goals, right? Still pushing, challenging them, not letting it go. Well, we know you have these horrible life experiences, so we're just gonna, treat you with soft gloves.
Yeah.
It's like, no, we're still challenging you.
Yeah.
Like
we don't
understand
advocate coddling kids.
No, no coddling.
We do not advocate
right?
coddling kids.
Right.
We want good stress.
Right. And that's another workshop with good
Right.
stress versus negative stress.
Right.
But that happens when you challenge someone with shared power. You have that respect. You're not some drill coach who's yelling at, or the coach just got fired for smacking a player in the head. We're not saying that. We're saying challenge them, but you have to respect them and expand their possibilities. I go back to the kid from Coney Island. When Stephon Marbury was in the barbershop and he told that young man, you could be president. And the kid looked at him with tears in his eyes and said, no one's ever told me that. That's the power of mentoring. Not to say, oh, well, let's see, you're good with your hands, you should be a mechanic. There's nothing wrong with that. But let's expand the possibilities of what else that young person could do.
All right.
All right. So we have 3 minutes left.
Quickly, do this.
quickly. Let's leave it open for question and answers, and then Laura will throw the exit survey into the chat. But I will, go ahead.
And if you enjoyed hearing James Miles, aka the Fresh Professor, talk, and myself, we have a podcast.
Yes, we do. Schoolhouse
Talk.
Talk. So I'll stop sharing the screen. Thanks, Laura, for putting that into the chat. And we'll just leave the last 2 minutes for questions and answers and hear your thoughts.
What's James and Chris, what's next steps? Is there like a part 2? Is there more to come of this right here? And I know you just gave us a teaser today, but what's next?
Yeah, we want to do part 2?
I'd love to do part 2.
Yeah. Yes. So answer your question, Tom. Yes. The podcast is called Schoolhouse. You typing in there?
Yep.
Schoolhouse Talk, and it's on Anchor.
With an exclamation point.
Yeah. And Laura put the survey into the chat. Go ahead, Laura.
Yes, I was just going to say, please fill out the survey. This will be really helpful as we look to improve things and do better all the time. And we really value your feedback. So that'd be really helpful if you all could fill that out for us. Yeah, so thanks for being here and just open it up for any questions.
And
We'll
I guess
definitely put that in the newsletter. Yep.
I was saying, like Tom's question being, what are the next steps? Let's get deeper into neural pathways and the research behind, like, how do we actually change behaviors, and that it's not, like what are the key factors that are supportive in evidence-based practice? Because I think it would be amazing if we had mentors across this state who can actually walk into a school and raise the question like, so what's the evidence-based intervention right now that this kiddo is working on? Because I want to incorporate that in my mentorship.
Yes.
So with talking about neural pathways and the firing and synapses. So we got into that a little bit, but you kind of see with that, like you can detect depression using those neural pathways, and you can detect trauma and things of that nature. But it's not like we're going out and it's not like we're giving everyone a brain scan, you know. We're not giving everyone a CAT scan or a MRI or a EEG.
You don't need to.
So I guess my question is trying to identify, like, you're not going to diagnose anyone,
No.
but identify some of the things that might inform you that about like what that kid might be experiencing, so that you don't necessarily trigger something. Like you're not trying to diagnose them because one, legally you can't, but two, you just can't, but you're also trying to say like, okay, he's saying this, that, or the other, right? This kid might be depressed, so how do I go about like my mentoring process, like with the intuition of that? Like obviously you want to go and talk to someone who might have like a closer relationship with say the school or something, like, hey, I'm noticing this, but like what can we do as mentors?
So
Yeah.
Go ahead. You got it, James, or do you want?
No, I was saying that's a great question, and that's pretty central to the critical mentoring aspect, and that's involving the entire community. So if we're seeing a young person in crisis, one, know if that young person needs medical support like ASAP, right? That's key. If it's just like, oh, they're in a depressive state versus depression, right? Which is two different right?
things there. Yeah.
Two different things, right? You could be in a depressive state and not clinically depressed. And say, all right, let me help you navigate so you can figure out how to, because you have to catch it, check it, and then change your behaviors. That's on us to help support that process, but we can't make it happen.
Right.
I don't know if that helped explain that.
And
to you,
we're
Justin.
not suggesting anybody is diagnosing anything.
Nope.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Renee put down like I knew about the EEP standards with contacting the parents and things of that nature. I just was just trying to get the perspective of critical mentoring, like how even if it doesn't go that far to where like we think it's like maybe it just feels like they're in a kind of just depressive state. They're not in anything that's not anything that seems bad per se. I can't say bad. Depressive state's always bad, but they're in a state of mind that's definitely not where you want them to be. How do we go about like while we're working with them, using what we know to track that and I guess uplift them to the extent that we can.
And if I can just add a couple things, I think, so one of the things with critical mentoring is really understanding the support systems that a young person already has in place. And that could be something like an older brother who's not living in the house anymore, or somebody at the school, or a family member or somebody else in the community. And so like knowing who some of those support systems are for the young person that you're working with, it could be like a friend's parent. And so there's that component so that you can reach out to whoever is more qualified for that topic, right? It might be a question of like sexual health. And like for me as a mentor, that might not be the person who wants to have that conversation, but the mom of their best friend might be somebody. So I can tell them, this might be a really good conversation to have with your friend's mom, who you are really comfortable with and seem to have open conversations with. So there's that piece. And then I think you also have to do some exploring of how like culturally some of those issues have been handled within their community. So my husband is Chicano, his parents are from Mexico and Guatemala, and historically his parents and the culture, the Latina culture, it's like mental health is not something that we really talk about. And if you're having these bad feelings, you just like need to stop it. Right. And so understanding how culturally some of those, like especially mental health sort of things are handled is really helpful as well. So that you know, if you bring that up to their parent or somebody, understanding what that response might be, and it might be helpful to go to somebody else like within the school. So just having some of those components and really understanding how those interact with the young person you're working with will also be really helpful.
I couldn't agree with more with everything you said.
Great.
Because I really want to emphasize a point of,
I was just saying thank you. Like that, this whole I think this clarified a lot of stuff for me.
Great. Thank you. I just really want to emphasize that again, like the critical mentoring perspective again here, it's not always like a lot of our conversations have been about the kiddo's behavior.
Yes.
Right. When we think of Brofenbrenner, what is the environment that kiddo is in? And if that is a racist, toxic environment, maybe some of these maladaptive responses that kiddos are behaving in makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's about the responding to something wrong in the environment. And as a mentor, I'm quite certain you could maybe articulate a little more of that for that kiddo in that school environment and advocate for, look, the behavior kind of makes sense here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
People are dropping M-bombs around this kid and that doesn't really respond well to it.
Yeah. Right. This is awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us on this conversation. Once again, the surveys in the chat. So fill it out for those that are still left. And we will see you at the next one.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. That was fun. Thank you for the
Thanks,
conversation.
Chris.
And
Yeah.